First, a notorious crime that 2 months ago made headlines all over Britain. On Wimbledon Common in southwest London, a young mother, Rachel Nickell, was waylaid and repeatedly stabbed. Her scratched and bruised 2-year-old son was found clinging to her body. It appears to be a random killing, which of course makes it extremely hard to solve. So tonight, detectives are putting all their cards on the table and they're appealing for the whole nation's help to name the killer. The appeal is in 2 parts. First, for crucial witnesses, some of whom have yet to be traced. Second, an appeal to the killer's mother or friends or family. In the next few minutes, Superintendent John Bassett is going to reveal everything that's known about the murderer, including a great deal that's never been revealed before. Someone watching must be able to piece the clues together. This is an area known as the Mound. Behind it is the main A3, and south of the Mound is where Rachel walked that morning with her son and the dog romping off ahead of her. Just in front of her is a path that leads to a bridleway. This is her path seen from the air, and this, marked with an X, is where she met her killer. First, the hunt for the remaining witnesses, most of whom have come forward, people on the Common.
Yes.
You still think there are others?
Oh yes, I think there are a number of witnesses who've yet to come forward. In fact, as late as Friday, a very important witness was seen by us, so there are more to come forward.
And not just on the Common, but I know in the cemetery to the west of it, and also north of the A3 towards Putney and Roehampton.
Yes, that's right. There was a witness seen north of the A3, running towards the Roehampton estate. He was a man dressed just in blue boxer shorts that morning and had a bundle of clothing under his arm. We don't think he's involved, but we'd like to eliminate him from the inquiry.
Okay, so if that was you, that may not be a very flattering picture of you, but please do call us straight away. Okay, now to identify the killer. Remember the date, Wednesday the 15th of July. This is what we know so far. A mother and her 2 teenage sons saw a man here by the curling pond. Now that was about 10:15. It's about 15 minutes before Rachel was murdered. It's 5 minutes walk from here to the murder scene. The murder scene again marked with a cross. The man was in his 20s or 30s. He was tall, more than 5 feet 10, and had short brown hair. He had a white shirt with buttons and dark trousers, possibly blue, and was carrying a small dark bag. Curiously, his belt was over his shirt rather than round his trousers. Or perhaps it was a dog lead. He seemed to bend forward slightly as he walked. Was he trying to hide his face? The family who saw him were suspicious because they had the impression he was following a woman. Now, that woman was the one who was traced on Friday. She thought the man was probably on his way to work, but a few minutes later, about 10:20, he reappeared back by the pond. No one saw him go down south on the open ground towards the Mound, but if he took this path, it would lead him through the trees towards Rachel Nickell. Now, if that was you and you didn't head down here and didn't encounter Rachel, you're nonetheless a key witness. Now is the time to call 081 811 8181. Then perhaps 3 minutes after the murder, a man was seen here. He too looked suspicious because he turned his face from the witness as though he didn't want to be seen, and he seemed to crouch down as though he was trying to wash himself. Indeed, there is a small stream here. Rachel's killer would certainly have her blood on him. This man too was in his late 20s or early 30s. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, and he too had short brown hair. He wore a light top and loose-fitting jeans or trousers. Again, he was carrying a dark bag. Again, if it was you and you had nothing to do with the murder, call us now, 081 811 8181. Now, from this point, let's add some informed conjecture. A consultant clinical psychologist has been handed evidence of Rachel's murder, and he's been comparing its hallmarks with other psychopathic killings. He's drawing up a likely profile of the killer, and though it won't be completed until next week, his official guidance is already as follows. The killer is under the age of 30. He lives locally. He still lives at home with his mum or parents, or alone in a hostel or a bedsit. He's untidy and disorganized. It's possible he has a bike, but he probably doesn't drive a car. He's a low achiever, so he's never done well at exams. He's not very good at conversation. He has few friends and has solitary hobbies. He may have an interest in martial arts. He likes pornography, including some of the violent sort. He doesn't have a steady girlfriend. If he's had previous girlfriends, they'll have found him unsatisfying, sexually inexperienced, and wanting to act out domineering gameplay. He's pestered women before. Indeed, he may have been caught for minor sex offences. He may well have an unskilled job, though if he does, remember, he certainly had that Wednesday morning off back in mid-July. His family will know that something's wrong with him, but they'll obviously find it hard to admit, even to themselves. They'll have noticed his mood changed after mid-July. He was upset or excitable for a few days after that. Above all, he could cause a tragedy and suffering like this again. Now, remember, some of these guidelines could be wrong, but if you can put several clues together and they fit someone you know, we all know the importance of this. Please do call us. John Bassett, it's going to be so difficult for a family, whatever their suspicions, to ring. I mean, to imagine that someone close to them, or a girlfriend, someone that close to them at some stage could have done this.
Yes, it's going to be very, very difficult. But I would appeal to the females of the Wimbledon area to come forward and identify this man. He is a local man, and I believe a mother, sister, or girlfriend knows the identity of this man. Women have an instinct for men that are odd like this. This man is dangerous and he's ill and he needs attention.
I know most unusually in this case for witness, just for this programme, you have sought from the Crown Prosecution Service and achieved a guarantee of immunity from anybody who's involved in minor offences.
Yes, that's right.
What about confidentiality, promising that families won't be involved?
Well, I can promise any family that rings me that their identity will never be revealed and they can have complete confidence in myself and my team.
Can I repeat? I mean, friends and family, of course, will always have a sense of disbelief, but it's easy to eliminate people who are innocent. It's a matter of life and death to find a man who's guilty. So if you've even the slightest hunch, please call. Could I add, the killer himself, according to these psychologists, may be deeply troubled by what he's done. He may not be able to understand it or explain it, but he can put himself in a position where people can help him and make sure he's not the cause of further tragedy. All it takes is a phone call. If you have any information, please call. You can ask to speak to a woman if you prefer, and there are BBC researchers here too. Or you can call the incident room in Wimbledon, that's on 081 947 1212. Please persevere if you find any of these numbers busy. Wimbledon 1 again, 081 947 1212.
In the summer of 1992, the savage killing of Rachel Nickell shocked the nation. It sparked a huge murder inquiry. In a groundbreaking operation, police used an undercover detective in a honey trap. They arrested their prime suspect.
You ambushed her, and you pushed the little boy face down into the mud. Then you stabbed Rachel 40 times. No comment.
But the operation turned out to be deeply flawed.
The police are fallible, and in this case, you know, they got the wrong man.
Rachel Nickell's killer remains at large. What went wrong? Wimbledon Common, South London. 1,100 acres of woods and fields. By mid-morning on July the 15th, 1992, the Common was filling up with visitors. But just 300 yards away from the main car park, a secluded wooded area concealed a horrific scene. Michael Murray is a retired architect. At about 10:35, he was taking his dog for a walk.
We came up this path, and I saw what I thought was someone sunbathing. I saw a bare leg. But as we got closer, I realized that this was something quite different and horribly tragic. There was a small child, 2 or 3 years old, who was pulling at the arm of his mother, who was lying covered with blood on the ground. I heard the child shouting, "Get up, Mummy, get up." It was heartrending. She needed levering off. His hand was gripped tight round the mother's arm. And he was just hysterical with distress. Poor thing was covered in blood.
The police quickly sealed off the scene. One of the first to arrive was Detective Chief Inspector Mick Wickerson.
And I can honestly tell you that this is the most horrendous and vicious attack that I've ever seen. It was a beautiful blonde girl with the most horrendous throat injury, and she was soaked in blood. And then, of course, you know, the true horror of what had happened hit me.
From the outset, it was clear that this murder would attract intense media interest.
She was a very attractive young mother, and that is one element that attracted so much media attention. The time of her death was relatively early in the morning, so every news bulletin, every newspaper could get the maximum of that day's coverage.
Clearly, it was an absolutely horrific attack. That says to the folks on the streets, we're dealing with a psychopath here. Secondly, the fact that the young boy was involved, you know, journalists have children too, and would have appreciated, you know, that this is a sort of dark nightmare for every parent in the land.
More than 500 people had been on the common that morning. The police allowed them to depart after taking their details. Only one vehicle remained. It belonged to the murder victim. 23-year-old Rachel Nickell lived in Balham. She had taken her son Alex to Wimbledon Common for walks because she felt safer there than in the parks nearer her home. Rachel's partner, and the father of little Alex, was Andre Hanscom. He'd once been a tennis coach and was now a motorcycle courier. Suddenly, he was thrust into the media spotlight.
I led him through the door, and he was taken aback by the number of flashbulbs and interest. And we sat down together, and I held his hand under the table, and just sort of gave it a reassuring squeeze every so often.
I would say to anybody who does know this person, no matter how they feel about them, please come forward before he destroys anybody else's life.
Rachel's parents, Andrew and Monica Nickell, were holidaying in Canada. It took the police 4 days to trace them. Paul Miller was sent out to break the tragic news before the press did.
Andrew stood there and took it all in, took one sharp intake of breath when I mentioned her throat. He took me to one side and said, I will never ever forget what you've done for my family. Thank you so much. It just blew me away. I'd given him the worst news imaginable. And there he was, thanking me for what I'd done. What had I done?
She can never be replaced in our lives. We can only try and slowly pick up the pieces. But our lives will always be less rich than when she was alive.
The murder squad was based at Wimbledon, led by Detective Superintendent John Bassett. The crucial role of evaluating suspects was given to a newcomer from the flying squad.
Yeah, 993 from OP1.
No sign of any suspects.
Keith Pedder had just been promoted from Detective Sergeant to Inspector.
We'll let you know in the next couple of minutes.
Age 35, he was bright and ambitious. Pedder would become the driving force on the squad.
The fact that we had no one coming forward saying that they'd actually seen a blood-stained man decamping from the common surprised me, and it struck me at the time that whoever was responsible for this had had the luck of the devil.
The hunt for Rachel's killer would finish Keith Pedder's promising career and severely damage the reputation of the Metropolitan Police. Rachel Nickell's killer had disappeared without trace. Now police needed forensics to help track him down. Rachel had been sexually abused as well as stabbed. DNA evidence from a strand of hair or a trace of blood or semen could convict a suspect. The glade in the woods was examined in minute detail, but all to no effect.
We were faced with the appalling situation. We had no stranger's blood, we had no fibres, we had no hairs, we had no forensic evidence, we had no eyewitnesses. And the question that was uppermost in our minds is, where on earth do we start?
The post-mortem revealed the full extent of the savage attack. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times. Someone somewhere must have seen a blood-stained suspect.
Rachel's major bleeding injuries were actually to her neck, and it's my belief they were inflicted by someone standing behind or possibly to the side of her, in which case they may well not be covered in blood. The other stab wounds to the body probably wouldn't produce a large flow of blood that would contaminate someone. The forensic scientists would have been able to find the fine sprays of blood on the clothing of the assailant, but they wouldn't be apparent to someone walking past them on the road or on the common.
With no forensic evidence, detectives had to investigate a vast array of suspects. They considered Rachel's friends and contacts. They traced local sex offenders. They examined other murders for similarities. The squad had to eliminate nearly 600 suspects put forward by a concerned public.
They all were looked at, despite some very, very intensive inquiries in respect of some of those other suspects. There was no evidence to put them either at the scene of the common or to link them with Rachel's death.
There was only one person who had seen the face of the killer, Rachel's son Alex, a month short of his 3rd birthday. Detectives hoped he might provide vital leads. Alex was taken to a child psychiatrist. She said that it would be painful but therapeutic for him to recall what happened. Seeing Alex relive the murder of his mother was a harrowing experience.
He would start playing with his toys, he would make a lot of noise, and the psychologist was saying, you know, could you help the people here catch this naughty man? What did he do, you know? And the noise would be getting louder and louder, and the boy was trying to shut it out completely. Your heart just bled. There was one occasion where he was writing on some paper and talking about the man that had hurt Mummy, and while we were sitting there, he had the pen in his hand and started jabbing the pen on the paper, faster and faster. And then he went up to Andre with the pen like that, and it was dramatic to say the least.
Slowly, Alex revealed that the killer was a white man with short hair. He wore a white, buttoned, collared shirt, outside blue trousers. He had dark shoes. The man had produced the knife from a black bag. These sessions helped form the intense emotional bond between the murder squad and the Nickell family. They wanted this killer caught. At the scene of the crime, detectives set a trap. They hid a surveillance camera in a tree. Buried sensors were linked to an alarm. The ground around the site was soaked with an invisible chemical that would mark a suspect's shoes.
Had we actually had someone at the scene who then later denied it was him, we could actually say, well, yes, it was you, because we had this specific chemical. It was thorough. It was complete.
The police kept watch around the clock. Then the sensors were triggered. Officers moved in, only to find a group of intoxicated teenagers. The press got hold of the story, and the surveillance team had to be withdrawn. After 2 weeks, the investigation was making little headway. It was time for a radical new approach. Could a psychologist come up with a profile of the kind of man who might have committed such a horrific murder?
What you have with a psychologist usually is an insight into the criminal mind. I think where it is very effective is in serial murders and sexual offences such as rape, where there is a certain psychotic implant which is used by some of the most prolific offenders.
Senior officers brought in forensic psychologist Paul Britton. He was briefed by detectives and visited the murder scene. Like the fictional cracker, he now had to think himself into the mind of the murderer.
Closing my eyes, I tried to step back into the pretty woodland glade on Wimbledon Common. An image was forming in my mind. I knew how this killer functioned. I knew what drove him, because I had seen the same impulse in other people whom I'd interviewed and treated over the years. I knew this killing was a decisive stage in a fantasy process that had been rehearsed for years before it ever became a reality.
Britton's handwritten offender profile aimed to help the police narrow down their list of suspects. Among other things, it said that the killer would live within easy walking distance of Wimbledon Common. He would probably be between 20 and 30 years old. He would be single and isolated, living at home with a parent or alone in a flat or bedsit. He would have a history of failed or unsatisfactory relationships. His hobbies and interests would be unusual. Most worrying of all, Britton predicted that it was almost inevitable that the killer would strike again. But it was traditional detective work that brought the first breakthrough. Police analyzed hundreds of witness statements and realized one particular woman had seen a man behaving suspiciously minutes before the murder. She helped create an artist's impression. Was this the face of Rachel's killer?
Tonight, detectives are putting all their cards on the table and they're appealing for the whole nation's help. The man was in his 20s or 30s. He was tall, more than 5'10", and had short brown hair. He had a white shirt with buttons and dark trousers, possibly blue, and was carrying a small, dark bag. Curiously, his belt was over his shirt rather than round his trousers. Or perhaps it was a dog lead. He seemed to bend forward slightly as he walked. Was he trying to hide his face?
Some 800 viewers rang in. Several people named the same man. He lived on the Roehampton estate, less than a mile from the site on Wimbledon Common where Rachel Nickell was found. Police believed Colin Stagg was a good match to the artist's impression and Paul Britton's offender profile. He was 29 years old, unemployed and unmarried.
I was just in complete shock, because at that time I didn't know the difference between being arrested and being charged. So as far as I was concerned then, you know, I was being charged for the murder of Rachel Nickell.
The offender profile had also said that the killer would have unusual interests. Inside Colin Stagg's flat, Keith Pedder was astonished by what he found.
The back bedroom had drawing of pagan deities on the walls. There was a pentagram marked out on the carpet. There was also a hooded black cowl and habit in the wardrobe. Quite clearly, we were dealing with a very unusual individual.
Detectives now had 3 days to interview Colin Stagg. He was rapidly becoming their prime suspect.
It was very, very difficult to actually pin Colin down to answer specific questions. You would ask him a question, put something very pointed to him, and he would come up with the most illogical response by way of answer.
I was getting more and more frightened, and I couldn't think of anything coherent to say, so my words were being mixed up, and that was being used against me. I couldn't think clearly about what times I was on the Common that morning, and I was getting that wrong, and yeah, and it was just really a stressful time for me.
Pedder asked Stagg to describe his movements on the day of the murder. He said he had taken his dog for a short walk on the Common sometime between 8:15 and 9:15.
The only people I saw was a dark-haired woman with her hair up, pushing a buggy with a child in it, and I said good morning to her as I passed her, and she said good morning back. Behind her was a broad man, short dark hair, quite a menacing looking bloke.
We checked our database of witnesses and people who said they were on the Common at the time, and we could find nobody who matched the descriptions that Colin had given us.
Rachel Nickell had been killed at around 10:30. Colin Stagg's alibi was that he was back home by 9:15. But one of his neighbours, Mrs. Susan Gale, told police that she had seen him going onto the Common at about 9:25 a.m.
I remember clearly the meeting she described in her statement, but it was not the day of the murder, and she has got that day wrong.
We went back to Mrs. Gale and said, are you sure it was the day? Are you certain of the time? And she was totally adamant.
You kept walking. And then I carried on walking, and then my youngest son...
This woman, Jane Harriman, had described a man seen acting suspiciously at about 10:10. It was her artist's impression that was shown on Crimewatch.
And he paused, and I sort of looked at him to smile, and he half smiled and turned his face away. He didn't look at me, he just turned his head away, and he seemed unsure of which way to go, and I didn't look back. Then I carried on walking past.
Mrs. Harriman had taken her children to a nearby pond. A few minutes later, she'd seen the same suspicious man. She was concerned because she thought he was following a woman. At 10:23, she saw him for a third time, heading in a new direction. This would have put him in the right place at the right time to have killed Rachel.
This individual was not me, because the description of this man is a much taller individual, and loads of people have commented on what basically a short-ass git I am, you know. There's no way I can be described as being a tall man.
2 days after his arrest, Colin Stagg was taken to an identity parade at Brixton Police Station. There, Mrs. Harriman identified him as the man she'd seen on Wimbledon Common. Detectives now believed that Colin Stagg was the killer, though they did not have enough evidence to charge him. The only thing he owned up to was nude sunbathing on the Common. This matched a complaint from a woman about a flasher. So Stagg was charged with indecency. At Wimbledon Magistrates Court on the 21st of September, he admitted indecent exposure and was fined £200. For the media, Colin Stagg was now an irresistible target.
Once he had that conviction, it was a sort of signal to news editors that we were right. We were right to suspect this man. And it may be the police were not unhappy about the press following that agenda.
The publicity had one result that would change the whole direction of the inquiry. Detectives were contacted by a woman called Julie. Some 2 years earlier, she had placed an ad in a Lonely Hearts column. Colin Stagg had replied and had almost immediately sent her a graphic sexual fantasy letter. This letter gave Keith Pedder the idea for an audacious undercover operation. Might Colin Stagg be encouraged to reveal his deepest fantasies to an undercover detective? And would those fantasies match those of the killer, as assessed by Paul Britton?
These would include the use of a knife to stimulate, penetrate, and control the woman in his fantasy. As he reveals more, the fantasies would increasingly come to feature a venue that closely resembles the woodland in which Rachel was murdered. At their highest intensity, they would replay important aspects of the killing itself, and the offender would derive potent gratification from recounting them.
The idea was to obtain evidence, physical evidence would have been ideal. The knife used to murder Rachel with her blood on, his fingerprints on, clothing that he had worn on the day with Rachel's blood on, that would have taken the inquiry to another level.
Keith Pedder believed the undercover operation would eliminate Colin Stagg from the inquiry, or prove his guilt.
One of my colleagues came up to me and said, "You realise that if it goes wrong, that's your career buggered."
We were treading on new ground. We were sailing uncharted waters. It was completely new, but we didn't know what else to do.
Pedder's daring plan was now approved at Deputy Assistant Commissioner level. No one could predict what would happen next. January 1993. At his flat near Wimbledon Common, Colin Stagg received a letter. Unknown to him, it had been composed by Keith Pedder and an undercover detective known only as Lizzie James.
Dear Colin, I hope you're not offended by this intrusion, as we have never met before, but I feel that I've known you for years. You may remember writing to a woman called Julie. Julie was an old friend of mine, and a little old-fashioned in her outlook, if you know what I mean. A while ago, while she was out, I read a letter that you sent her. I would be very interested in getting to know you more.
At that time, I still had no real sexual contact with any women. Bit of a late starter. I thought, well, you know, I've got nothing else going for me. You know, it's not as if I've got women queuing at the door for me, is it? So, yeah, I jumped at the chance.
Over the next 7 months, Colin Stagg and Lizzie James would exchange 43 letters. Forensic psychologist Paul Britton had helped design the covert operation and monitored the correspondence.
The underpinning factor was that we should not introduce new themes that hadn't already been introduced into the correspondence by Colin Stagg. I suppose the analogy would be that if he hopped onto one step, we would hop onto it after him.
But the defense would later call an expert to allege that the police were shaping Colin Stagg's replies.
The inducement really was, you can have sex with me and we'll have a loving relationship, but unless you committed the murder of Rachel Nickell, you're no good to me, and the relationship will be terminated.
In early March 1993, Lizzie James wrote to encourage Colin Stagg to be more explicit in his letters.
I can't help but think you are showing great restraint. You are showing control when you feel like bursting. I want you to burst. I want you to feel all-powerful and overwhelming, so that I'm completely in your power, defenseless and humiliated.
She is saying to him, you're not opening up enough. you're not giving me what I want. I want somebody who's dominant, I want somebody who can humiliate me, and that's really going to turn me on. And that is sort of clear evidence of her trying to shape his answers.
Colin Stagg replied on the 18th of March.
Your letter was great. I have now some idea what you want. I've written another special for you along those lines. I've called you a few dirty names whilst writing it, but please don't think I am a violent man. You will be left humiliated and dirty. I want to and will give you a fucking good sorting out. You need a damn good fucking by a real man, and I'm the one to do it.
And he's sort of saying, I'll do this, but I don't really mean it. I'm not going to be hurting you in any way. So he is trying to fit in with what she wants, but doing it in a rather gentle way.
By May 1993, Colin Stagg was pressing for a date with Lizzie James. The acting skills she'd used inside criminal gangs would now be deployed against him.
She can be anything to anybody. Her ability to think on her feet and make good, valid, instant decisions made her ideally suited for this particular scenario.
Waiting in the rain in Hyde Park, Lizzie James was about to embark on a psychological battle of wits. Could she persuade Colin Stagg to reveal his innermost secrets?
She had been given a very, very detailed briefing by Paul Britton as to what to expect, how to behave. Not only had she got to play her part, she also had to stay as far as possible within the realms of what is accepted legally. The task facing her was one that would frighten the living daylights out of most people.
Inside an unmarked van, Keith Pedder and Mick Wickerson monitored the operation.
You could cut the air with the tension. We were obviously listening to it. We had numerous police officers surrounding them, but wow, they were close, and it was very, very tense.
Colin Stagg arrived early and waited watching under a large tree. Detectives were concerned. Was he suspicious of Lizzie James?
I was basically just waiting under this tree. It wasn't the type of weather I liked to be out in anyway, and I was actually thinking about, you know, just going home, forgetting all about it. And then I saw a woman, and I thought, that, you know, that must be her. You know, there's nobody else about. And I approached her and I said, "Excuse me, are you Lizzie?"
It was Colin Stagg's 30th birthday. Lizzie James gave him a personal stereo and a baseball cap. She'd chosen the cap to make him more conspicuous to detectives following him.
I felt very uncomfortable because it was a public place. I don't like eating in public. I've never been to restaurants before and I was very clumsy. I was stumbling. I was very Hugh Grantish, you know, without the accent, you know.
To encourage Colin Stagg to confide in her, Lizzie James now confessed to a secret of her own. Her lurid cover story, created by Paul Britton, was that she had been abused as a teenager by an occult group. She had joined in the ritual murder of a young woman and baby.
He asked me to cut the woman's throat, and with the cup, I caught the woman's blood. There was this big orgy, and I was with this man. This man was the best ever.
When this horrific tale unfolded, the reaction from Colin Stagg was almost nothing. Very, very matter of fact. A reaction that I certainly hadn't expected. I would have expected at that stage, good night, Vienna.
I just thought she was off her head more than anything. I don't think I really believed the story. I think it was an idea, perhaps, that appealed to her more than anything, and that's what basically turned her on. But at the end of the day, all I wanted to do was have a shag, and that was it,
At the end of the date, Colin Stagg walked Lizzie James to the park gates. Stagg now handed her a fantasy letter he'd written before the meeting. Keith Pedder claimed it introduced a disturbing new element of sexual violence into the correspondence. Further proof he was onto the right man.
The contents included a sexual fantasy on Wimbledon Common, which involved the use of a knife, the cutting of flesh, and the flowing of blood. And this was the first time that there had been any indication, any mention of knives or blood or the use of any of those items for sexual gratification.
Paul Britton alleged Stagg's letter displayed a rare and highly deviant sexuality.
The chances of there being two such men on Wimbledon Common when Rachel was murdered are incredibly small.
Basically, I was drawing up on my own experiences of what I've read and what I know about the occult, that a knife is always used. And also, I mean, it's not that hard for human beings to make up stories.
That Stagg never introduced any theme. If Stagg mentioned a knife first, it was in response to suggestions that any idiot, frankly, would have picked up on, that they wanted the fantasies to become more extreme.
The police felt that Colin Stagg was at last opening up and revealing his secrets. Lizzie James sent him a graphic sex fantasy on tape to keep up the pressure. During a series of secretly taped meetings, Lizzie James now pushed Stagg about Rachel's murder, after he'd told her he'd been arrested and questioned about it.
To tell you the truth, they think I did it, even now. I got pulled over by the police bank holiday Monday, May 31st.
I wish you had done it, and knowing you got away with it. That's brilliant. I wish you had.
Legally, Lizzie James was dangerously close to the edge. She was openly enticing Stagg to confess. But confession was the last thing on Stagg's mind.
Almost a year after Mum Rachel Nickell was raped and stabbed to death on London's Wimbledon Common, the man who was the police's prime suspect has told the Daily Star, "I didn't kill her."
With such a public denial, he was unlikely to say in private or disclose to Lizzie James anything that contradicted what was said in that article, therefore undoing 4 or 5 months of painstaking work.
On many occasions, Scotland Yard will call in the senior editors and they'll say, look, publicity in this case is going to cause us a major problem. They chose not to. Now, why they chose not to is a matter for them, but they clearly can't accuse newspapers of scuppering their inquiry when the newspapers are unaware of the tone that inquiry is taking.
In a final meeting, Lizzie James pressed even harder. Stagg revealed details about Rachel Nickell's body, details that the police believed only the murderer could have known. When Keith Pedder interviewed Colin Stagg in September 1992, he had shown him a photograph of the murder scene to try and shock a reaction out of him.
It was a distant shot and from the back. Her hands couldn't be seen, her head couldn't be seen. It was more a scene-setting photograph rather than one of the detailed scenes of crimes photographs.
Now, at a picnic in Hyde Park 10 months later, Lizzie James claimed Colin Stagg had clearly demonstrated the position of Rachel Nickell's hands, palm to palm.
That was something that was uncannily accurate to the way that Rachel was found, and again could not have been seen from the photograph that had been shown in a much earlier interview.
In fact, Rachel's hands had been left crossed at the wrists.
I basically tried to show her what I could remember from the photograph. I placed both my hands palm down on the ground and to try and lower myself into a kind of fetal position, and I tried to show that, and the photograph was taken from the rear end. And as I straightened myself up, I brushed my hands from the husks of the beech nut of the tree, which are small prickly things. So, but the fact of the matter is, at no time whatsoever did my hands come into contact either across the wrist or palm to palm.
In essence, Colin Stagg was being given a choice: admit more knowledge about the killing, or kiss goodbye to Lizzie James.
I don't know what to say, you know. Well, I never really met anybody like you, you know. Since you first started writing to me and that, you know, it's like a dream come true for me, you know.
If you're not that man, or not done that kind of thing, you'll never, ever, ever be able to fulfill me. You'll never, Colin, never.
Despite these enticements, Colin Stagg never admitted killing Rachel. The operation was aborted. Would the evidence police had acquired stand up in court? At dawn on the 17th of August, 1993, Colin Stagg was arrested for the second time.
I was just dumbstruck. You know, I just thought, you know, this is the end. You know, my life's coming to an end. You know, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison for something I didn't do.
Tonight, several police forensic experts moved into Colin Stagg's neat garden in southwest London and started digging deep holes. They collected several objects in a black plastic bag.
This time, Colin Stagg chose to exercise his right to silence.
I gave you every opportunity. I'm giving you the opportunity now. If you were on the common but didn't do it, tell us. No comment. Colin, do you propose to answer any questions that I'm going to put to you? No comment.
Psychologist Paul Britton had a video link to the interrogation. He and the police had agreed a strategy to get Stagg talking by having Lizzie James walk into the interview unannounced.
That's not true. No comment. Martin?
The signal was rubbing my ear, and at that point there was a pause in the questioning, and you could hear footsteps along the corridor. Then there was a knock on the door. And Lizzie James came in and introduced herself.
Yes, I'm a serving police officer. For the purposes of this interview, I'm known as Lizzie James.
There was a look of shock on Colin's face, and that was quickly replaced by one of what I would describe as anger.
And I thought, I haven't murdered anybody just because I wrote dirty letters, for God's sake. You know, it doesn't make you a murderer.
Isn't there anything you want to say to me, Colin? It'll be your last opportunity.
Stagg now knew he had been set up, but he continued to make no comment. He was formally charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell.
Is 11 minutes to 7. Then we're switching the tape off.
Colin Stagg would spend the next 13 months remanded in custody. The police case against him was not strong. It still lacked any forensic evidence. But it was underpinned by psychologist Paul Britton, who argued that a man's deviant sexual fantasies could identify him as a murderer. This controversial form of identification had never been put before a British court.
In effect, what Mr. Britton was purporting to do was to use his psychological profile to identify Colin Stagg as the killer. But what that presupposes is that the psychological profile was correct.
Nevertheless, the Crown Prosecution Service felt there were grounds to proceed. A stipendiary magistrate decided that Stagg had a case to answer and committed him for trial at the Old Bailey. The police now looked forward to the evidence being tested before a jury.
We thought that we had a case that was winnable. At no stage did we believe that we were fatally flawed in law. We thought we had a viable chance of a successful prosecution.
Colin Stagg was brought to trial. But even before a jury was sworn in, his defense team argued that the undercover Lizzie James material should be ruled inadmissible and thrown out. The judge, Mr. Justice Ognall, took several days to consider before delivering his ruling on the 14th of September, 1994.
The atmosphere in the court that day was electric. There was a sense that after Lord knows how many man-hours spent investigating this pretty appalling crime, that we were coming to a head.
The final moment came. We was ordered upstairs, but halfway up this stairwell, the officer in front of me stopped me and said, "Hold on, they're not ready yet." And then the officer turned around to the other officer and he said, "You know, blimey, it's packed up here. I've never seen this place like this before."
Colin Stagg sat passively in the dock. The Nickells were sitting apprehensively at the back of the court. And Keith Pedder and I were sitting directly under Judge Harry Ognall. And we didn't know what he was going to say.
Mr. Justice Ognall rejected as dangerous the idea that a psychological profile could be admissible as expert evidence to prove identity.
The judge made his ruling, which seemed to go on forever. I couldn't understand most of the legal jargon, obviously. And there was a moment when Bill Clegg, my QC, turned around and gave me a sort of kind of sly wink and a grin. And I thought, yes, it's going my way.
The judge went on to condemn the undercover operation as
a substantial attempt to incriminate a suspect by positive and deceptive conduct of the grossest kind.
The aggressiveness of the judgment just shocked us. We were sitting there while he put the knife in and turned it and hung us up to be dried out in front of everybody.
Mr. Justice Ognall ruled that all the material gathered by the undercover operation was improper, unfair, and inadmissible. The prosecution collapsed, and no further evidence was offered against Colin Stagg.
I was expecting the judge to either say, you know, you're guilty, you're going down, or you're an innocent man, you're free, and that, but none of that was said. So I felt I was in limbo. But Jim Sturman approached me, he put his hand up to me and said, "Congratulations, you know, I'll see you around the back." And I looked at him, I went, what? What was going on, this sort of thing, you know? I was that kind of, you know, dumbstruck.
Police condemned as Rachel Nickell murder trial collapses.
The sensational collapse of the case against Colin Stagg dominated the news headlines.
The judge recognised that there was never any evidence against me, no forensic evidence, no confession evidence, nothing at all.
But for Rachel's parents, Andrew and Monica Nickell, the outcome was devastating.
The law has been upheld, but where is the justice? I understand that the police will now keep the files on my daughter's murder open, but they are not looking for anyone else.
Keith Pedder was treated like a pariah. He was criticised, he was not supported after the judgment, and he had no career, and he suffered enormously from that day onwards.
The murder of Rachel Nickell remains one of the great unsolved crimes of the 20th century. I think her death touched everybody. Many of us have children, many of us go walking in the park. None of us expect to be attacked.
It's one of the images that will never go away. I haven't been back to Wimbledon Common since, and I resent that. I think every woman should be free to walk in the woods with her child.
At the end of the day, he's still out there, but until he's finally caught, you know, no woman is safe.
Colin Stagg has been through a version of justice, albeit truncated, and he has been found not guilty. But I wonder whether he can actually say hand on heart that he believes people, when they meet him in the street, believe that. But I do not believe the system served anybody that particular day.
And next week at 11, Real Life looks at one man, 6 wives, and...
Colin Stagg was the prime suspect in the Rachel Nickell murder case. He was charged after an undercover policewoman enticed him to talk about his fantasies of sex and violence. A judge threw the case out before a jury was even sworn in and condemned the murder squad's tactics. Although innocent in the eyes of the law, many people still see him as guilty. On tonight's Cook Report, he takes a lie detector test.
Do you consider yourself a violent man?
No.
He faces hypnosis.
You primarily came here to find out what happened on July the 15th, 1992.
And in the ultimate test, he goes for the truth drug, as we examine, for the first time in public, Colin Stagg's defence.
Were you the one to first mention the cutting of human flesh to cause blood to drip onto a woman's breasts?
Yes.
She was a shining light, a bright star in my life and everybody who knew her.
My name will always be linked to the murder of Rachel Nickell, and I've got to live with that for the rest of my life.
Did you kill Rachel Nickell?
Wimbledon Common, scene of Rachel's murder, and the start of a very unusual investigation for us. It's unusual in that not only does the man at the centre of the case have a perfect right, as do we all, to be presumed innocent, but also a judge has already thrown out the case against him. We wouldn't presume to try him again today, but what we are going to do, with his cooperation and for the very first time, is to test his side of the story, a story a jury never heard.
That on the 15th of July, 1992, Wimbledon Common, you murdered Rachel Nickell, causing her death by multiple stab wounds.
These are police videotapes of Colin Stagg's interrogation. His legal team gave us complete access to his defence case. He's always protested his innocence and pointed to a lack of any forensic evidence.
I mean, there was nothing there to tie me in with any crime whatsoever.
There's no forensic evidence?
No forensic, no.
Which there wouldn't be, one would think, after 2 months. If there had been, it would have gone, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't know, they took samples off me, my body, hair, pubic hair, skin, saliva. If there was any of that on Rachel Nickell, then surely they would have, you know, discovered it.
The young mother was found with her throat slashed. She'd been sexually assaulted.
A minute search of the scene resumed today. Officers scouring
Her son, just
Wimbledon
2 years
Common.
old, was found clutching her blood-stained body.
This is the point where Rachel Nickell was confronted. The killer, we believe, came down from the side of the hill here. On the day of the murder, we found an area of flattened grass, which we believe was a makeshift hide whilst the killer watched Rachel walk along this path. Alex, the little boy, told us that as soon as his mum had been confronted at knife point, he was picked up and thrown into some brambles. We know Rachel was confronted at this point because the T-shirt she was carrying, belonging to her son, had her footprint on it and was found here. She was then goaded at knife point back to the foot of the silver birch tree here, where the stabbing and the sexual assault took place. The killer was taking an enormous risk. The attack, we believe, would have been carried out in not less than 3 minutes. With so many people on the common and in such an exposed area, it leads us to believe that the killer's mental functioning was such that he was prepared to take any risk to achieve his aims.
2 months after Rachel's murder, police created a computer-enhanced photo fit of the suspect. They built up a psychological profile of an unemployed local man, sexually inexperienced and obsessed with pornography. The profile and the photo fit led police to the door of Colin Stagg. The 29-year-old self-confessed virgin lived on his own in a flat nearby. Police discovered he'd written to a woman through a Lonely Hearts advertisement 18 months earlier, suggesting sex on Wimbledon Common. Colin Stagg is wired to a lie detector by a leading polygraph operator. He's been tested before, but not this thoroughly. With 60 questions he refused to answer during police interrogation.
Did you ever meet Rachel Nickell?
No.
Were you charged with indecent exposure as a result of your habit of sunbathing naked on Wimbledon Common?
Yes.
Though not accepted in Britain, lie detectors are widely used by American police and are accepted by most US judges. They work by measuring minute variations in specific body areas.
Breathing, both thoracic, chest, abdominal, stomach, the pulse rate, and the galvanic skin response, the sweatiness of the palm. And those 4 things, some people can control their breathing from the chest, but not from the stomach, and vice versa. Nobody can control all 4 of those simultaneously. Did you visit Wimbledon Common that day between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. approximately?
Yes.
Colin Stagg said he went to the Common twice on the day Rachel was murdered, but wasn't there at the time of her death. We discovered his account of his first walk didn't tie in with statements from other witnesses. Leaving home before 8:30, he says he crossed Roehampton Lane, round Skio Pond, then went through an underpass at Kingston Road, past a small hill, then headed back home, arriving before 9:30, where he fell asleep watching a quiz show, either Crosswits or Lucky Ladders.
We've got the TV Times of the day. It wasn't on. It hadn't been on for a month. Lucky Ladders hadn't been on for even further. What was on the day was a children's show on BBC One, an old Tarzan film.
ITV.
It was on ITV, was it?
Yeah.
Well, on ITV, on your favourite station on Channel 3, it was a phone-in show.
You've got to bear in mind this was 2 months after that day. So obviously, you know, nobody can remember what they were watching on telly 2 months ago, you know, at a certain time. But it was around about that time that quiz programmes were coming on.
So it fitted what you needed to say, some people might say.
They'll say what they like.
I will put to you that what in fact happened on that day is that you didn't go home and fall asleep at 9:25, but in fact you were seen entering the Common by a woman called Susan Gale on the 15th of July.
No comment.
This woman knows you by name.
Susan Gale was walking from Jerry's Hill towards the Putney Vale Cemetery underpass when she saw him at 9:25. He was wearing a white T-shirt and a bum bag and was heading towards the windmill. Colin Stagg remembers the meeting but insists it wasn't on the day of the murder.
Mrs. Gale says that she saw you on the windmill path at 9:25. You say at that stage you were at home drifting off to sleep in front of the telly. Who's right?
I'm right.
Why should Susan Gale tell lies.
The school supervisor told police she specifically remembered the day and the time because she had to return home to take her mother-in-law to collect her pension.
She says that she saw you that morning entering the Common at 9:25 by the Putney Vale underpass. And that she saw you and your dog fights with her dog, and you raised your hand and you said, as much as to say, it's all right, I'll put him on the lead. Is she wrong about that? Is she wrong about that, Colin? No comment.
First of all, you said you didn't see her at all.
When did I say that?
Well, in statements to the police, you didn't see her at all.
Perhaps because they mentioned her by name, and at that time I didn't know her name.
I see. You then said it must have been after the murder. You sat down and thought about it when you were being held overnight and wrote 11 pages of handwritten notes saying it must have been after because you remember the police cordons, the tapes and things.
Yeah.
Then she says, no, I was not on the Common afterwards, only once, 6 weeks later, at a completely different time and a different place. And after that, you change your story again and say, well, it must have been before.
Well, I was trying to remember the day she was describing. And before I found out later that she never went on at the Common after the murder.
Well, then you had to change your story to fit the facts, didn't you?
Well, no, I'm just saying that I remember the day clearly of what she was describing, but it wasn't the day of the murder. And I was trying to remember if I ever saw her before or after the murder. So when the police told me that she never went on the Common after, so it must have been before. So
well, it could. The answer could be. It might have been in between. It might have been the day of the murder.
It wasn't.
Well, she says it was.
I'm saying it wasn't.
Another witness, Jane Harriman, told police she saw a man she later identified as Colin Stagg 3 times. Firstly at 10:10 near the Royal Surrey Regiment Memorial. Then 7 minutes later around the curling pond. And then at 10:23 coming out of the woods and heading back towards the memorial. She was sure he was wearing a white shirt and carrying a black bag. He says he wore a black T-shirt and has never had such a bag.
You say it can't be you because you don't possess that sort of clothing. You say I knew it couldn't be me because I've not got a shirt like that. That's nonsense. She describes your way of walking.
Let's talk about Mrs. Harriman, who identified your unusual walk, which you admit you have, and she picked you out at an ID parade. She says she saw you on the Common at 10:10, 10:17 and 10:23. In other words, 5.5 minutes walk from the time and the place of the murder.
As far as I can remember, this man, the only funny walk that he had was the very fact that he was trying to hide his face from this woman. So obviously...
Now, she describes a stooping walk, which is what you got.
Well, yeah, I've got a stooping walk, but this man, if he had something to hide, he would stoop to keep his face away from anybody watching him.
She also was the person who was responsible for giving the information for the artist's impression, leaving aside the body, but the face, which you agree looks like you.
Apart from the hairline, yeah.
So you're saying she's wrong too?
Yeah, I'm not that man.
A police helicopter circled the scene around 11:15 a.m. Colin Stagg told us the noise woke him and he decided to take a second walk on the Common. During his trip, he says he talked to 2 police officers who told him exact details of the murder, details he then mentioned to other witnesses during his walk.
You said to me that PC Crouch told you what time the offence had happened. Can't possibly have done that. It was well into the afternoon, late into the afternoon, when we suddenly discovered the time that the murder had occurred. And as far as the PC on the periphery of the Common would have been concerned, it could have happened the night before. But all of a sudden, you are telling lies within an hour to an hour and a half after the offence, displaying a knowledge as to when it was safe to be on the Common and when it was safe not to admit being on the Common.
You also said to PC Couch, who was one of those cordoning off the Common, that you were there between 8:15 and 8:50.
I can't remember the times in detail, but it sounds about right.
Well, that would be a safe time to admit, wouldn't it? Because you also say that you'd learnt from PC Couch that the murder took place at around about 10:30.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, PC Couch was not in possession of that information at that stage. Neither were any of the senior officers involved until some hours later.
The police are dirty bastards, you know that. They set people up. They change their statements so they can set people up. Everybody knows that.
Do you consider yourself a violent man?
No.
Question 28 on the lie detector test said, "Are you a violent man?" And you said?
I said no.
Right. Did you stab your brother?
No, I nicked my brother.
You nicked your brother. But you stabbed him, or nicked him, with what?
An old pair of blunt secateurs.
Why did you give the police a drawing of what is plainly a knife?
That was involved in it, but I never used that. It was the secateurs I nicked him with.
And you're not a violent man?
No.
Why did you attack a cameraman? You went for him with the dog's chain wound round your fist.
By then, I'd been termed a lot of things by the press, by the media, and I was under a lot of pressure. Every time my name was mentioned, I was called a flasher, pervert, even murderer. If somebody was going to keep calling you that, you wouldn't go and greet them and give them a good sturdy handshake, would you?
There are two good examples of violence there.
I was reacting like any normal human being would.
Well, that's for others to judge, I guess. Some people, though, would say that this is another example of your continuing inconsistencies, and that there have been so many untruths, so many lies told, perhaps you don't know the difference between the truth and a lie.
I do, quite strongly.
Colin Stagg was the murder squad's prime suspect, but they didn't have enough evidence and had to let him go. Top-level clearance was then given for a sensitive undercover operation. Knowing that he'd sent a pornographic letter to a Lonely Hearts contact, police decided, on the advice of a psychological profiler, to trick him into writing to a new pen friend.
Did you enter into correspondence with a female calling herself Lizzie James, who you later discovered to be an undercover policewoman?
Yes.
Did you meet this Lizzie James on 4 occasions?
Yes.
Were you hoping to enter into a physical, sexual relationship with Lizzie James?
Yes.
Legally, Lizzie James cannot be identified.
Would you like to introduce yourself formally?
Believing Colin Stagg, if he was guilty, would only confess to somebody he could trust, the psychologist advised that she should tell him she'd taken part in a black magic killing.
Yes, I'm a serving police officer. For the purpose of this interview, I am known as Lizzie James.
Before that crucial meeting with Lizzie James, Colin Stagg prepared a graphic letter detailing violent sex using a knife on Wimbledon Common. Within minutes of Lizzie confessing her invented secret, the letter was handed over.
You're saying that after the first meeting, you then introduced the knives and the blood and things like that?
Yeah.
After she told you her guilty secret at the first meeting?
Yeah.
But that's not true, Colin, is it? Because you gave her that letter which you had written in advance,
right, yeah,
as she left. So that letter had been written before you knew the guilty secret.
Yeah.
So what you told me wasn't true. It wasn't as a result of learning of the guilty secret because you'd written the letter in advance.
During that meeting, you had no opportunity to write that letter there. Do you remember?
No comment.
And in fact, you didn't even go to the toilet once during that meeting. Do you remember that?
No comment.
You handed me that letter, and I got into the taxi, and you walked away.
You handed that to her as she left?
Yeah.
And that was the first time these deviant ingredients had been added?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes you are very definite about what you've said, and sometimes you're not. And once again, it seems that's to suit as well. People would have a great deal of difficulty in believing you because so many things are inconsistent and so many things change.
I wrote those letters. The first letter you're describing, I say it again and again. I use my head. I know it's hard for people to believe that I am intelligent. You can figure people out if they give you hints.
Yeah, but that's not what you said. You said you didn't introduce any of these things until she told you her guilty secret.
No, I told you that was my confusion. I thought you were talking about another letter.
Well, how much confusion is there about the other things you've told me?
There's no confusion there.
Well, once again, some people might find that hard to believe.
Let's leave them guessing, eh?
In all, Lizzie James was sent dozens of letters, each more revolting and sexually depraved than the last, some disturbingly similar to the attack on Rachel.
Colin, if I were to show you some 30 or 40 letters that you'd exchanged with Lizzie James, would you have anything to say then? No comment. Concerning your sexual activity, in particular, your desire to have sexual intercourse and sexual practices on Wimbledon Common and in open woodland involving the use of knives, no comment, where blood is caused to flow. No comment.
Some of the ingredients of these fantasies, sex with a stranger, nakedness in the park, bondage, all that sort of thing, dripping blood, these things also apply, they also apply to the way poor Rachel Nickell died.
She wasn't naked as far as I was known. You know, she just had her clothes torn down, as far as I discovered.
And a lot of the things that are in your fantasies turned out to have happened to Rachel. Are you saying there's another man running around somewhere who has an identical set of fantasies to you?
They're not my fantasies, they're stories that I made up.
Well, stories that he made up then. Stories in... He's got the same story in his head,
well, no,
driving him as you have.
The man who done that, the difference between that man and me is that he has these fantasies, otherwise he wouldn't have done that. And he enacts out his fantasies.
So you didn't act out your fantasies or stories, but somebody else with an identical set of stories or fantasies has acted them out on Wimbledon Common.
Yeah, of course. Somebody much more dangerous than me, because he believes in his fantasies and his stories. Well, to him, they're his fantasies, but these are just stories I've just made up at the top of my head.
You told the truth, did you? You told the truth that you were at home by 9:15 at the latest on the day that Rachel was murdered. I think what happened is once you'd been seen by the Harrimans, you walked off down the windmill path, you walked over the top of the tumulus and you sat down in a little patch of grass. I think you actually described in one of your letters to Mr. Jones the fact that you see this gorgeous blonde woman approaching from the distance. Is that what happened to Rachel? You looked down from your vantage point and spied her, and you rushed down and you ambushed her, and you pushed the little boy face down. Pushed the little boy face down into the mud. Then you stabbed Rachel 49 times.
Test 4. Did you kill Rachel Nickell?
No.
After 60 questions, our tester spent 2 days analysing the recorded body signals before declaring his findings.
Colin Stagg categorically did not kill Rachel Nickell. So, with that result behind you, would you welcome a civil case brought against you by, for example, the Nickell family?
Yes, I would. If the Nickell family were convinced that I was innocent, and that would make me feel more at ease in my life, that I would like to actually meet the family and look them straight in their eyes and say, you know, I'm not your daughter's killer.
But the lie detector was only one of 3 tests we asked Colin Stagg to take. We also took him to a hypnotist used by many doctors who told us he'd resisted all attempts to induce hypnosis. And after a psychiatrist explained that the truth drug, though completely safe, was also difficult to defeat, he finally refused to take it.
I was dead against the truth drug because the very fact of having chemicals into my body. My only vice is smoking a lot.
Wouldn't it have been worth it? I mean, it's much more believable, so we are told, much more severe, much harder to cheat than either hypnosis or the lie detector.
My main concern is what would be the long-term effects.
Isn't the long-term effect, or couldn't it have been, to convince more people that you were innocent?
Well, I consider my health more important.
Yet all these other questions, Colin Stagg, remain unanswered.
I've answered them as best as I could, and I did my best.
And it's up to the viewers to decide who to believe.
Fair enough.